bring in now again, as we're going to keep this live picture up of what's going on, and you all just saw live the explosion of the Al-Amin Mosque in Gaza, the Hamas mosque, as you all just heard that explosion when the Israeli military struck that. Stephen Hadley's with me, a former national security advisor to President Bush, and James Zogby, the president of the American Arab Institute. Stephen, this goes straight at the entire issue here, which is the issue of civilian casualties and whether they are avoidable, and what situation are they ever acceptable, that both sides are arguing about. The United States, the president, after he spoke to Benjamin Netanyahu on the phone, the summary of the call included the United States, quote, serious and growing concern about the rising number of Palestinian civilian deaths and the loss of Israeli lives. Is Israel at risk of losing the hearts and minds of its allies, and I should say of its most important ally?
Certainly it is. These kinds of casualties, Israel, I'm sure, is going out of its way to try to minimize them.
Right.
You can minimize them. You cannot eliminate them. And quite frankly, part of Hamas's strategy is to feature these kinds of civilian deaths, these very regrettable deaths, and the suffering of the Palestinian people on international media as a way to put pressure on the Israelis to accept a ceasefire. It's right. Regrettably part of the tactic of this situation.
James, certainly, you know, it is part of the tactic, and yet you hear Carl Penhall reporting the leaflets are coming down and telling people to flee from the area they just came from. I mean, his point being that they don't have anywhere to go.
Look, Gaza is one of the most crowded places on earth, and Gaza City in particular. The density and the poverty and the despair are just overwhelming. And I think as I'm watching these pictures of the little kids who are living in Gaza and what they see and how they feel, how their mothers feel as they're watching this all happen with nowhere to go, I think it's rather shameful to say that they're being used as human shields. This is their home. This is where they live. And they really have nowhere to go other than to be at home. There have been some tweets from people in Gaza saying, you know, I'm not a human shield, I'm just at home, and my home was bombed. I've been there too many times, seen those people in the camps, the poverty in Gaza, to not feel a tremendous compassion for what they're undergoing. And let me just say that, you know, I've heard this argument, Netanyahu says the Palestinians use their suffering. I don't know of anyone who uses suffering in the way that Benjamin Netanyahu does and the Israelis do. They've been exploiting this issue now. Every single casualty is played out in such dramatic ways. And here we have over 1,000 people dead. And frankly, Hamas is being blamed for it. I held no sympathy for Hamas. Their tactics are deplorable, and their ideology is despicable. But this is something that Israel has done. They have provoked this situation, and right now they want to shift the blame to somebody else because they cannot accept responsibility, paternity, for the disaster, the humanitarian disaster they've caused.
Stephen, I would imagine you have some very serious questions about James' analysis.
Well, I don't, in terms of the sympathy for the suffering of the Palestinian people, I mean, we all have to feel for that. What is going on is, you know, the Israelis are once again trying to damage Hamas and to try to buy some quiet from these recurring missile attacks. They tried this in 2008, they tried it in 2012. They achieved some calm, but they would say that the threat returned. And what Netanyahu is thinking is there something they can do this time that will hurt Hamas to the point where Hamas would agree to some kind of arrangement whereby, in fact, they would demilitarize, they would get these missiles out, and I would hope even agree to the return of the Palestinian Authority to
Stephen,
Gaza.
I want to break in briefly, go back to Carl Penhall, because
Sure.
There's an F-16 now flying right where you are, Carl.
Absolutely, Erin. There is intense drone activity overhead right now, and we've also just heard another F-16 flying overhead. It seems to have been flying lower than normal. We have seen those F-16s going by, pumping out decoy flares as they go. They obviously fear that Gaza militants may have some kind of surface-to-air missiles, so those decoy flares they pump out are to try and avoid that kind of thing. But we've heard those F-16s flying overhead now, possibly an indication they're getting ready to target something, Erin.
All right, and we're going to keep listening for that in Carl's shot, just to make sure both Stephen and James know that, as well as our viewers. So far, we've seen one explosion just in the past few moments, where a mosque was the target of the explosion by the Israeli Defense Forces, the Al Amin Mosque, which is controlled by Hamas. Stephen, what about the point, though? And I guess, James, let me put this question to you. Michael Oren, the former ambassador from Israel to the United States, wrote in his words in the Washington Post, Israel must be allowed to crush Hamas. And he said, and that means civilians will die. But there will be fewer who die if Israel is allowed to crush Hamas now than who will die if this continues. And there is a pause that allows Hamas to once again use money from its allies to build up weapons, buy more rockets, and attack again.
Is that for me or
yes,
Stephen?
that's for you. Sorry.
Look, listen, here's the issue. I lived through the invasion of Beirut in 1982 when Israel was going to destroy the PLO. And 10 years later, they were sitting down and talking to them. And we've seen this not just in 2008 and 2012, but Israel went into Gaza in 2006, in 8, in 10, in 12. It's every 2 years they do it. They call it mowing the lawn. But the lawn keeps coming back. And so at the end of the day, as Stephen knows, as his president tried in his second term, a negotiated settlement is what is necessary, a peace agreement that provides justice for Palestinians and security for the Israelis. And the U.S. has to play a much more vigorous role in that at the end of the day, but we haven't played that role, and I think that's the problem. We haven't accomplished it, but trying to destroy or... There is no violent solution to this conflict. There is no violence that will end the occupation. There's no violence that will squash the resistance. There has to be a settlement.
Stephen, is it something in your view that the world must accept that there will be thousands of civilian deaths?
No, the world doesn't have to accept it. The question, though, is how does this end in Gaza? And can it end in a way that reduces the risk that it will occur again? This is the third round we've had of this.
Yes.
And I think the question is, can we get to a situation where Hamas agrees to demilitarize, will accept that kind of agreement? Then the question is, how do you enforce that agreement? We had such an agreement in Lebanon in 2006. It never was enforced. And I think it is, can Hamas get to the point where it will accept demilitarization, accept the Palestinian Authority to return to Gaza, to ensure that the agreement is complied with, and then to begin to open up Gaza to the flow of goods and materials that they need to rebuild Gaza? And can that provide a more sustainable basis and ultimately maybe even a path towards a broader negotiated settlement, the way James talked about?
All right, well, we're going to just hit pause here, a brief moment of quiet, as you can see in that live picture from our Carl Penhall's camera shot. There was another loud explosion just a moment ago, though, and Carl is going to figure out exactly where that struck. One just before that, though, did strike a mosque a moment ago, as you all were watching live. The breaking news of the explosions in Gaza, our coverage of this continues with these live pictures here from our cameras. These are live pictures of what's happening right now in Gaza City. This is a live picture from our Carl Penhall's camera as the picture, the fighting is raging tonight between Hamas and Israel. A mosque has been hit. Drones are buzzing overhead. You're seeing these flares illuminate, and then we've heard two significant explosions. Carl Penhall is standing next to this picture on his phone to talk to us. Your building, I know, Carl, had been rocked by the first explosion of the El Amin Mosque, a Hamas mosque. But there was then another explosion, I believe, right?
Both our phones have dropped. Okay, I'm dialing back in time.
All right, everyone, what Carl was saying is his phone dropped and he's dialing back in. As soon as he gets back in, I'm going to bring him in. But Stephen Hadley is still with me, former National Security Advisor to President Bush, and James Zogby, the president of the American Arab Institute. Stephen, James made the point that you can't call the use of civilians human shields in Gaza City because it's so densely populated and people have nowhere to go. Do you agree?
It's very difficult. You know, the Israelis were calling, and James is more the authority than I, but the press reports are the Israelis were calling for civilians to vacate certain areas, and Hamas was saying to them, no, stay in your houses. Right. You know, this is an unseemly thing to do. Because it maximizes rather than minimize civilian casualties. You understand from Hamas's standpoint why they do it, But, you know, look, the victims here are the people of Gaza City, and that's why I said the issue is how does it end, and can it end in a way that that avoids the repetition of this cycle, which we've now seen now for the third time.
And James, I mean, is this, though, the reality is that Hamas is willing to kill its own people, to allow its own people to be killed because they benefit when those images are shown around the world. That's the horrific truth. They benefit.
I think that's an unfair way to characterize it, though. Look, again, I'm no supporter of Hamas, but Israel held on to the fact that those 3 young teenagers were dead. They knew about it. They held on to it for a couple of weeks and exploited the hell out of it and went around the West Bank arresting hundreds of Palestinians. I mean, the fact is that sides do that in war, but the issue is that people are dying because Israel is killing them, and killing them in ways that do not give them any hope or any option, any horizon. Here's the point. Look, in the best of times, right after Oslo, the border was closed. Palestinians lost the single largest source of income they had, which were day labor jobs in Israel. 80% of youth in Gaza were unemployed for almost 20 years. These young men who are fighting and dying now have never had a job and no prospect of a job. You want to end Hamas, you want to end violence and extremism, create hope. Give Palestinians a sense that there's a better future for them, that in fact the borders will be open, that commerce can take place, that in fact they can have jobs and produce families and live a decent life. Hamas preys off the despair, and that's where extremism comes from. Want to end extremism, create hope.
A powerful case. Carl Penhall, I believe we have you back with us now. Sorry, we had lost you for a moment there. Tell us what you're seeing and what you can tell us about the explosion we just heard.
Well, I also wanted to pick up on a comment your guest made there when there was mention of Hamas telling people to stay in their homes. Earlier this evening, we heard a loudspeaker message, whether that was from the street or from a mosque, telling people go inside your homes for your own protection. That simply was a message to tell people to take cover. Take cover, why? Because there had been no warning in this part of Gaza City that the Israeli military would be targeting this part of the Gaza Strip tonight. And at the moment that we heard that loudspeaker message telling people to go into their homes for their own protection, that was because illumination flares were coming down over Gaza City, and not only is there a risk that those illumination flares could start fires below, but also these illumination flares come with a very heavy canister, and as that canister falls to earth, it clangs very heavily on the pavement. That could easily go through the roof of somebody's house. It could kill somebody if it falls on them. Also, incidentally, about 300 yards from where we are now, there's a UN school, one of the shelters for these displaced Gazan people, and we saw a couple of the illumination rounds fall into there, the illumination flares fall into that school as well. Luckily, that didn't start any fire, Erin.
All right, Carl Penhall, thank you very much.